Hey, it's me, Dr. Newman. How are you? I hope you're well. I really need a haircut, as you can tell. And I'm making a short video because I wanted to talk a little bit about, follow up a little bit about our discussion of the dead and to give some context and some information that I think will be useful and information and informative to you. I was originally going to do this as an audio lecture, but I thought I'd just make a brief slideshow to help you follow along at home with a little table of contents with some of the key terms that is going to bring together some of the stuff that we talked about last week. So yes, we're talking about The Dead by James Joyce. It is a novella, or a long short story, perhaps it's more accurately said, from it was published in 1910, and the events in that collection of short stories all take place in Dublin, and they all take place in the year 1904. Which is coincidentally, not coincidentally at all, also the year that James Joyce sets his great novel Ulysses. So yeah, one of the things I wanted to talk about with respect to this, to the short story and to prose in general, as we get into the modern period, right? Things we're dealing with a very different kind of audience and a very different context for literature. We talked about ancient Greek tragedy. And how it was produced for citizens of Athens to go and watch it in a contest. We talked about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and about how that was written for a courtly performance in a small coterie. But modern literature is written for publication generally, and for commercial sale. And so this has led to a distinction in modern times between different kinds of genres, which describe different markets, different audiences. And one of the common ones you'll hear about is popular versus literary fiction. And one of you wrote how you didn't really care for the characters, and and another one of you wrote that the story didn't intrigue you enough to make you want to keep reading. And these are important considerations when you're thinking about popular fiction, which is about characters that we like. And it's about stories that are compelling and interesting. I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I don't believe in a hierarchy between popular and literary fiction, but I think they serve different purposes and have different ends. Israel described the beauty of the story as its movement from emotion to emotion. And one of you talked about how you got invested in the dinner scene because of the authentic feeling. And I think these are things that speak more to a literary fiction mentality, where the point isn't so much about reading for the plot or about getting invested in characters who you feel close to. Both things that I enjoy doing, let me tell you, but is more about a realistic representation of reality, an artistic statement about what it means to be human, that goes beyond entertainment, for whatever value entertainment really does, especially at times like this. I think nothing wrong with a little escapism. So The Dead is definitely literary fiction. A modernist like James Joyce, in many ways, really, that was the period in which that split became decisive. When you got the idea of avant-garde art. And you could think about like cubist painting or surrealism or something like that. That is intentionally difficult, that intentionally is uncomfortable and maybe hard or alienating to read, versus stuff that's soothing or decorative or simple or there to sort of reaffirm your sense of the world as it was, right? And of course, look at this guy. Doesn't he just look like an avant-garde, like, I am a serious artist, except he would have had an Irish accent. I can't do an Irish accent. I am a serious artist. No, I sound like that. No, that's terrible. But he was definitely on the vanguard of this modernist movement. And we can talk about the disconnection. Hold on a second here. There we go. We could talk about the split between popular and literary fiction as one that helps us think about what Joyce is trying to do. We can also talk about the distinction between realism and modernism. One of you writes, I think it was Israel, I only really got invested during the dinner scene because of how authentic feeling that scene was. It felt like a real dinner shared amongst friends and family. Now that is, in a sense, is part of what realism does. Realism tries to produce an authentic depiction of reality, and often a reality that is present day, that is familiar, that is accessible. Realism seldom deals with the historical, the long ago. It doesn't deal with imaginary worlds or fantasy worlds. It tries to hold up a mirror to our reality as it is. And in the 19th century, when Joyce came of age, remember, he turns 18 in the year 1900. In the 19th century, realism was king. You think about authors like George Eliot or Charles Dickens, and they are trying to show all of reality, not just a kind of heroic, idealized slice of life, as in romance. And if you watched my earlier videos on chivalric romance, you'll see that there are continuities between romance and popular, specifically genre fiction. But the 19th century tries to show all of reality, good and bad, ugly and gritty, beautiful and sublime, but also just the everyday, the quotidian, if you will. It's a fancy word for everyday. And realism also, let's talk about narrative and narratology and narrative technique for a second. If you read every one of Dickens' novels, you will never once find Dickens to write something like, he thought this or he felt this. Everything is external. Everything is materially sensible by somebody who could be watching as if it were a photograph or a camera. It does not take you inside people's minds except for what people reveal of themselves. He might describe facial expressions. He frowned, he furrowed his eyebrow, he scratched his head, but you'll never see a representation of interiority. You'll never see the inner mind represented. And so Israel, going on in his entry, writes, after talking about the dinner scene and its realism, after that scene, I thought the writing changed to a style that was much easier to understand than the chaos of so many people in one place at the same time, and it allowed for quieter and more intimate moments, like everyone listening to Darcy sing and Gabriel remembering defining moments of his life with Greta. And then he goes on to talk about how he moves from emotion to emotion. That transition from exterior and social representation to private, individual, emotional is in part a transition which we can witness in this story from realism and modernism. Modernism is far more about the individual and the subjective and the interior. And so this is one thing that we see Joyce working out. He's kind of developing modernist fiction in the course of writing the short stories that belong to Dubliners. And the symbolism that some of you talk about is with the snow or whatnot, and the incorporation of poetic techniques of using imagery to express interior states or abstract concepts. Is something that is very much a part of modernist fiction. One of the other things that you guys talked about that is super important to this story as well, and to Joyce's own life and experience as an artist, is history and politics. And of course, this also speaks to some of the theoretical approaches that we're dealing with these weeks, including post-colonialism, Marxism, new historicism. Joyce is obviously an Irish writer. He's a very famous Irish writer. In Toronto, there was a James Joyce pub. It was an Irish pub. But James Joyce left Ireland at a relatively young age, physically, but he never mentally left it. All of his short stories and novels take place in Dublin, where he lived his early part of his life. And it's very much, in many ways, about the Irish situation and what it means to be Irish. And so one of you talked about Gabriel and his identity and his sense of identity and the conflicts of identity that he has. Several of you talked about this. Katie, Olatokunbo, Michael, I think. But the thing is that James Joyce had a very specific problems with identity and what people might today call identity politics. And, of course, Olatokunbo brought up the conflict between him and Molly Ivors when they're dancing together. Now, here's the important thing. At the time that this short story takes place, Ireland is under all of Ireland, not just the northern counties, all of Ireland is under the dominion of the British Empire. It is completely controlled by England. And the reason people speak English in Ireland, just as the reason people speak English in Nigeria or India, is that the English took the English language there and made people speak it through imperialism. And so, but Joyce is a brilliant writer, and he's a native English speaker, and he loves the English language. And so he's one of the earlier people to articulate this post-colonial dilemma of how do I reconcile my dislike of English imperialism with my love of the legacy of English culture and the English language. And so this is one of the reasons why Molly Ivors calls him a West Briton. She, not him, James Joyce, but him, Gabriel Conroy, who I think in some sense is an alternate version of Joyce himself that Joyce rejects, that Joyce doesn't want to be. He doesn't just want to be a hired school teacher serving the imperial masters and doing his duty, cutting the turkey at the party, and just generally being kind of going along to get along the way that Gabriel does. And so the rebuke for Molly Ivors, who's a nationalist, right? And so there were different degrees of intensity of Irish nationalism. Some people just wanted Ireland to stay part of the British Empire. Some people wanted it to stay part of the empire but have complete home rule. Some people wanted complete independence, and there were a variety of spectrum of positions. Ireland did eventually get its independence around 1919 or so, 1920, but then there was a civil war, and that's when the North broke off in order to stay with the United Kingdom. And so Dublin here. So that's one conflict that's going on. Another conflict takes place not just on the level of politics, but on the level of culture, and that has to do with what does it mean to be an Irish person versus something that James Joyce had a very strong attachment to. What does it mean to be a European? What does it mean to be a cosmopolitan, to be a citizen of the world? James Joyce did not like the idea of an Irish nationalism that cut off Ireland from the rest of civilization and that only celebrated Irish achievements. If we look at his great novel Ulysses, it's about a Jewish guy of Spanish descent who lives as an immigrant in Dublin and who is an archetypal realization of the ancient Greek myth of Odysseus, right? The whole thing is based on the Odyssey. And so Joyce wants to bring people together, I think. He wants us to bring Irish culture, Irish talent, Irish tradition into a larger conversation rather than separate it off. And so he himself, I think, would have been critical of both Gabriel Conroy as a kind of just lackey of the imperialism versus the kind of staunch nationalism represented by Molly Ivors when she's like, why would you go bicycling in Belgium when you can go see the west of Ireland, so there's that sense in which Joyce is sort of negotiating or thinking through the different permutations of relationships that you can have with a nationalistic identity and what the limits of nationalism are, but also what the limits of a kind of servile cosmopolitan such as we find in Gabriel Conroy. And so this is one of the things that's going on. Another dimension of the history and politics as is being worked out in this is class. And oops, why is that there? No, I'm working. Discard time. No, keep time. There we go. One thing about class that we can see is there's the character of Mr. Brown. And if you're not sensitive or you're not really familiar with the context, there's that line on a certain page where they talk about how I think around 43 or 44 where they talk about or maybe it's 39. It's in the discussion the Pope saying that women can't sing in church in special positions. And they say, well, Mr. Brown, let's not have this discussion in Mr. Brown. He's of the other persuasion. What that means is Mr. Brown is a Protestant. And, of course, a Protestant, that means he's not, like the majority of Irish, a Catholic. These are, I hear people in the Ozarks here say, my mom's Christian, but my dad's Catholic, which always cracks me up because they're like, what they really mean is Protestant Christian versus Catholic Christian. They're two kinds of Christianity. Anyway, most of Ireland is Catholic, but the traditional ruling class, which comes from England and which still held social and political authority at this time, are Protestant. So there's a sense in which Mr. Brown belongs to a kind of imperial ruling class, but he's middle class, and these people are like music teachers, so they're kind of the lower middle class. And they're, Gabriel is a school teacher. They're not working class people. Lily is a working class person. And so we can see in the interaction between Gabriel and Lily a kind of discomfort that I think comes in part from class consciousness. And I would invite you to pay attention to how Lily's grammar is represented and how grammar is used and style of speech throughout this short story is used to represent class identity and so on and so forth. So that's one of the themes that's going on in here. Is Gabriel is and of course the dead guy Michael Fury, Greta's former lover, boyfriend, or whatever he is, worked in a gasworks, right? He worked in an industrial plant. So there's a sense in which, Gabriel's mother, we learn about her, was very aspirational with her pictures of Shakespeare and stuff like that. Very much a kind of a social climber, if you want to say that. But Gabriel, we hear the stories of his background. We realize that he is from a family, or he is a member of his family who has come up in the world through his education. But he has links to a working class background that he feels uncomfortable about, maybe embarrassed about, when we hear him. And he feels this embarrassment, I think, in some of his interactions with Greta. The representation of Greta is very interesting, and I think maybe we'll put off talking about that until next week. But I think that class and identity both come into how Gabriel relates to and understands Greta, his wife. One other thing that we can talk about from a Marxist perspective in this story is the way that it represents commodities, commercial goods. Think about how many things, how many foods, how many garments, how many items are described in this story. And of course, this is something that links this to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is also full of material culture. But how is it being used differently here? What does it represent? What, for example, does that discussion of galoshes, as I asked about in the discussion board, have to do with any of this? So, some of you are like, I don't really understand where this is going. It doesn't have a plot. It doesn't have any point. But if you're looking at it as a representation, as a window into an entire way of life that Joyce is looking back on and trying to reconstruct, that involves, as Katie put it, political and cultural tensions that characterize the Irish society of the time. When you're looking at how Gabriel sort of navigates that and understands himself through all of that, then we get a different sense of the story, I hope, and one that I hope that you can go back to and find more valuable and interesting. I do think the transitions make the story really give a rhythm to this story that can be surprising, as Michael put it. Right, we're in this crowded party, and then we leave, and there's this cold, and there's this dark, and there's this silence, and there's the coldness and silence and discomfort between Gabriel and Greta themselves, as they're both inhabiting very separate private worlds as they take their coach back through Dublin, back to the property that they're staying at. So I hope all of this has given you something to think about and has clarified some of the issues and themes in this short story. If there's any particular part that you would like more clarification about, or you have other questions or ideas, feel free to get on the discussion board or go into Teams or email me. And I hope you're all doing well. If you haven't gotten me your topic yet, please do for your final research presentation. And I hope you're doing okay and you're enjoying all the beautiful flowers in the springtime and stuff. And yep, I hope we all get to work together face to face again in the fall. So take it easy. Bye.